Okay, folks, so we have a little dead air here. Maybe I should talk. Do a little intro. We got a lot out of the first couple rounds of this, but what we're going to do tonight is take a lot of what we got last week and build on that because it was a foundation. We know that a whole lot of what we learn about boundaries or without boundaries as kids affects how we deal with boundaries as adults, and that carries on through the rest of our lives. So we're going to talk about the 10 laws of boundaries, and then we're going to talk about some myths. I hate microphones.
Thanks, Becky. This is my friend Becky, and I'm Michelle, and it's nice to be with you all tonight. So one of the things that the book said was that people raised in dysfunctional families or families where God's ways of boundaries are not practiced find themselves lost, confused, and easily hurt in adult life. They don't understand the spiritual principles that govern relationships and personal well-being. Those principles are the spiritual realities that God built into the world, He created, and they have never been explained to them. So they become prisoners of their own ignorance. We need to know these principles and operate according to them.
Ready?
Yeah.
So the first one is sowing and reaping. And you were going to talk about sowing and reaping?
Yes, I am. Okay. So the law of sowing and reaping basically means actions have consequences. And those are known as natural consequences in the world of child discipline. And interrupting these consequences for others prevents their growth. So enabling behavior is reaping the consequences for another's actions. And we are to allow natural consequences to happen to others because that's how others will grow.
And the result of not doing that, not allowing people to have their own experiences, suffer their own consequences, is that you wind up with codependent people and you wind up with people who are boundaryless. They don't understand when people set boundaries with them that it's not a personal attack and that it's actually a normal part of how humans interact with each other.
One of the things that Becky and I have in common, besides having worked together for many years, is that we both were raised in dysfunctional homes, and we're both adult children of alcoholics. And therefore, neither of us had a lot of boundaries, and neither of us really understood our own boundary setting with others. My boundaries were usually just like what Dad says is law. You don't violate that. And that's not a healthy boundary. And I also learned from my mother to definitely evade Dad's rage and to go along to get along. Those were the kind of boundaries I had. And unfortunately, those set me up for a lot of dysfunction in adulthood. Particularly in my first marriage, which we're going to talk about in the marriage chapter, Pastor.
And for me, my mom was an alcoholic that would have periods of sobriety and life was really good, but the rest of the time it wasn't, and most of the time it was dealing with a single mom who worked a lot, and I never knew what I was going to walk into. You become very guarded because you don't know whether it's going to be a good day, a bad day, or an in-between day, and what you say or do might make the big difference in how things work. There were very unclear expectations. I was expected to live by a certain set of very specific rules, all the don'ts in the world, and yet my mom was out doing all the don'ts that I wasn't supposed to do. Consequently, I married a guy when I was 16, 3 days before he went to Vietnam, and looking back on it, I think the thinking was I'm already being an adult. I mean, I was a freshman in high school. I'd come home and find my mom gone with a note on the table saying, I went so-and-so with such and such, and I'll call. And I was on my own. And because I was also adopted, I didn't have a lot of family support around. My grandparents were lots of times living, several hundred miles away from us, but they were my support. And I would call them when I needed help. So it was pretty chaotic, really.
I know, listening to some of you share about your childhood, there were things that I could relate to and things that I, of course, couldn't, because I didn't live your experience, but my lived experience was very much, even though my parents were there, I was very much abandoned. They were very into social clubs and drinking and partying, and I was not allowed to be in the same room where all that was going on. So I would be sent to my room, or if my parents were gone, I would have a babysitter, and usually that was some young teenager who didn't want me around either, so I'd be sent to my room. So I spent a lot of time alone, and it just became normal for me. My mother worked outside of the home, and which wasn't always normal in those days. I was born in '62, and so not a lot of women worked outside of the home. And so one of the things I found myself doing was seeking another mom, and with my friends' moms, and they would literally say, "You need to go home," because I was so stinking lonely, and I was an only child. So, the lonely onlys, it's a real thing, but for me it was even more lonely. And I was a latchkey kid. I walked myself home. I would overeat because I was bored to tears. There were a lot of things that I did that were so dangerous because I had no guidance. And it was really a strange upbringing. And honestly, because I was by myself so much, I became like a weirdy McWeird, And other kids were like, "She's weird." I had this vivid imagination. I was always writing stories. I was always playing. I played with dolls till I was probably 13 because I had nobody else to play with. And so that was my upbringing. It was a very strange one. And of course, there were these drunken people around me all the time. And my dad was full of rage. He was my very first Dr. Jekyll.
Okay, so, on, sure. Yep. You.
So the next one's law of responsibility. We are responsible to others to love them and help them, but we're not responsible for others, for their choices, their feelings, or behaviors. Without responsibility, we lack limits. I'm responsible for me. Others are responsible for them. But I am responsible to others. These are the things that we are to do. We are to speak the truth in love, Ephesians 4:15, building up the body of Christ. Neither harsh or judgmental, we are to, and we know that love without truth is empty. Galatians 6:2 says we are to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Mutual responsibility, care, and support among believers is a very important thing. And then a warning is that we are not to pervert justice. In Leviticus 19:15, we are to judge others with fairness.
And one of the things that comes out of that is when we take responsibility for our own selves and our own lives, we learn to love one another. And in that process, we learn about being able to deny ourselves. Not loving others is not taking responsibility for ourselves. We're called to love one another, not be one another. We set our boundaries, we take care of ourselves, and we allow other people their boundaries so that they can take care of themselves. It's not good to rescue others from their consequences, because when they do that, when we don't rescue people from the consequences of their sin, they just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so we enable, and they become codependent in the process.
Okay. All right, so the next one is the law of power. This is something that I did not believe I had whatsoever for a very long time. But you have the power to change yourself and to set your own limits, but you lack the power to change others. We do not have power over others. We cannot fix someone else. This is a true sign of poor boundaries. In my first marriage, I truly believed that I could fix that man. I mean, with every ounce of my being, I was out to fix him. And I learned in a very difficult way that that wasn't possible. We cannot force others to change their attitudes, behaviors, or decisions, even if they're destructive. So we are not powerless, and I wrote that in all caps. I'm yelling that, okay? And I'm yelling it to myself as much as everybody else. We do have power to change our own behaviors through the power of the Holy Spirit. We have the power to accept his strength against temptation. We have the power of repentance, humility, and submission to God, to turn from evil through repentance, to seek out and make amends to those that we have harmed.
Okay? Number 4, the law of respect. And this is a big one. It's a common word used by people with boundary problems is they and but. Well, they, but they. And you see that with people who don't set good, clear boundaries. It's always someone else. People who are codependent, people that have things like borderline personality disorder, it's all about they. Everything is always someone else's fault. It's not I. So when the focus is on others, we lose clarity about ourselves. So if I'm constantly looking at what other people are doing to me, what they haven't done for me, I can't see me. We think we know how they ought to whatever, and we want them to do it our way. That's how those people function. You know, if you only did it the way I told you to, even though what you told me to do was totally wrong. And with respect comes freedom. There's extreme personal respect that brings freedom to us as individuals, respecting the boundaries of others to gain respect for our own boundaries. When we respect the boundaries of others, we in turn get respect. Give respect, get respect. That's how we're supposed to function and interact with others. Not, are they doing what they would do the way I want them to do, or are they making free choices? Because if you're expecting people to do what you want them to do because you have poor boundaries, they don't have any freedom in their choices. It's like the parent who is the helicopter parent comes to mind. You know, because kids don't ever learn to move away from mom if mom is always hovering, preventing them from taking a step, preventing them from falling down. I thought of Micah the other night with the big scuff he had on his head. He's learning how to walk. And he's got a mom and a dad that will let him go out and explore and learn to walk. And he's going to fall, and he's going to get bruises, and he's going to get bumps. And maybe he will learn to go down the steps a different way than the way he did when he bumped his head. And that's how we learn. But some people never have that opportunity. So they never learn, one, that it's okay to make a mistake and get up and try over again. They will blame somebody else for their failures over and over again. So that's why we have to respect people's ability to move and differentiate in their own way.
One other thing about the law of respect is we must learn to respect people's boundaries that say no, and also people's boundaries that are a yes. And so that's something that was very difficult for me because my dads were always no. Everything was no. And but yet at the same time, if I'd say no to him, I would face some pretty brutal consequences. And so I stopped saying no. I would say yes to please everyone because that's what I had been conditioned to do. So learning to respect the yeses and the nos was something that I had to learn a little bit later in my development. I was an adult before I learned them. And I was a people pleaser because of having to always, toe the line with Dad. And I was towing the line because of fear. Everything about my life was about being afraid. When I think about the characters in Pooh, I was Piglet as a child. I was scared of everything because my dad was scary. And, later in life, he was a wonderful, sweet human, but it took a long time for him to become that way. And he had to put alcohol behind him with the help of Jesus. And once he did that, he was a lovely person, and I was able to move forward in a very loving relationship with him. So I'm not blaming him. I'm just saying that it took him a long time to find Jesus and to put alcohol out of his life. And, you know, he was sad for the way that he had been most of his life. But he was also full of amends and full of love by the end of his life.
The law of motivation. Giving is a big thing, biblically, socially, culturally. We receive constant messages about giving and receiving. The motivation in giving needs to be right. And I didn't bring it, but my motorcycle vest, in the motorcycle biker world, they call it a cut. On my cut, I have a little patch that says NGDGU. I'm the only person in the world that has one, and I got a special dispensation from National to have that. NGDGU stands for No Good Deed Goes Unpunished. How many times do you do the right thing for the right motivation and get slapped for it? It happens all the time. And I wear that for a reason, because it reminds me that I do the right thing because it's the right thing, not looking ahead at what I'm going to get out of it, not looking for recognition or some kind of reward or some kind of compensation. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And our compensation to that comes from the Lord. It doesn't come from the people around us. So if we're doing things expecting a certain response from people, that's a really poor boundary, because too often we find ourselves getting disappointed. And those are a lot of times the people who say, well, I try and I try and I try and I try, and nobody ever notices, and it's just not good enough. And they go through their whole life feeling defeated because they don't realize that, probably because of things that happened when they were kids or growing up, they were raised with that idea. It's like the no. You know, no is a two-edged sword. We can not say no because we're afraid of anger and retaliation and punishment, or we can not say no because we want to be accepted and we want to be approved and we want people to like us and care about us, because that's the only way we get cared about is if we do things for other people. So we never ever say no. We just keep doing and doing and doing. And the motivation isn't pure. It's not because we want to or we feel like it does our heart good to do it. We do it because we're afraid of what's going to happen if we don't.
It's said in the book that boundaries should be driven by love, that a yes driven by fear of conflict or abandonment is not a true gift. 2 Corinthians 2:9 says, another reason I wrote you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. That was Paul that wrote that. He also wrote another scripture that says, instruction to give as they have purposed in their hearts. What is our purpose or intention in our yes? Are we operating out of fear or love? Do we fear rejection or abandonment? Do we fear another's anger? Are we operating out of the need for acceptance? For me, that was people-pleasing. And this begins early in childhood.
One of the other things that was interesting, talking about Paul, Paul was the one that said the things that I would do, I don't, and the things that I don't really want to do are the things that I keep finding myself doing. And that goes right back to motivation, and the thing that I think comes out of that is that the Lord honors our motivation. If our motivation is good and right, it doesn't matter whether we are successful or we fail in what we're doing. He's going to honor our motivation and our heart above anything else.
The next one is the law of evaluation. We must distinguish between hurt, which is temporary discomfort from a boundary, and harm, which is actual injury. Boundaries may hurt, but they don't harm. Discipline and growth usually hurts because it results in change, and change is always hard on us. Consequences allow us to learn from our mistakes. Now, harm comes from suffering, and we are to balance how we treat others' suffering. We are not to force or cause someone to suffer, but at the same time, we are not to ignore the suffering of others. Psalm 22:24 says, listen to the cry for help And I believe the meaning there in listen is listen with discernment. Go ahead, Becky.
We must not decide our boundaries based on the other person's response or what we're afraid their response is going to be. Jesus talks about the narrow gate. It's always easier to take the wide gate, but that's not effective in life, and it's certainly not effective in the Christian life. We can empathize with the pain our boundaries may cause others, but we can't let that determine our boundaries. Our boundaries we have to be true to ourselves in setting our boundaries and true to our Christian calling. Confrontation will come, however, we need to be honest about our feelings and hurts and needs. When you start to set boundaries, people are going to push back against them, particularly if you've never done it with somebody before. I mean, if there's that person in your life, like, and I don't know how many of you have read the book, but there's all these little examples in there about, relationships people would have, and, how they don't say no, and they don't say no, and they get angrier and angrier, and they get more resentful, and it takes more and more of a toll on their life. And yet, they'll hold back and not set a boundary because they're afraid of what the response is going to be. And then when they do, there's a confrontation. Lots of times it's anger or resentment or hurt. Oh, how can you do that to me? I didn't think you'd ever do that to me, when you didn't really do anything wrong. So we have to be able to be honest about our feelings and our hurts and our needs with other people, and to be able to process that out with them.
So the law of proactivity. Define your values and limits proactively rather than just reacting with anger to others' behavior. And for every action, there's an equal reaction. That comes out of physics, right? But we are not to remain a victim, but to break free from bondage, becoming proactive people who are able to establish boundaries. Just as we were talking, I recognized something that I need to share, and that is, as I got older, I began seeking friendships that would harm me, and I began seeking adults who would look after me, like another mom. But somewhere along the line, I started seeking God. My next door neighbor was a Baptist children's minister at one point in my life, and he started taking me to Sunday school, and I started learning about Jesus. And I fell in love with Jesus. I went to every backyard Bible school there was. I went to every vacation Bible school. I would walk. I didn't have people taking me except for the pastor on Sunday. He would always drive me. But I would walk wherever I saw a flyer, I would go. My dad didn't like that too much, but it was always during the day when he was at work, so what he didn't know, whatever. And I started doing that from a very young age. So when I was about 14, my first year of high school, a lot of the kids around me were starting to party and all that, and I kind of hung out with a few of them a few times, and I thought, this is not the road I want to walk down. And then one day at lunchtime, there was a rally that Young Life was putting on. And they were singing songs that I'd heard at church, and they were having fun, and they were doing funny skits. And I was like, that's the crowd I want to be with. And so I started going to all of the Young Life things that were events that were happening. My dad just thought it was a school club, so I was getting away with it pretty well for a while. And we had a swimming pool, and I asked my parents, can I have a pool party with the kids from Young Life? And they were like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. So I had about 65 kids over one night, and my mother was like, no, this is not what we bargained for. And I said, Dad said yes. So I had all these kids over and these Young Life leaders over, and we had the best time, and they were so respectful to my parents, and they cleaned up afterwards, and they all left when they were supposed to. And a couple of the leaders stuck around and kind of talked to my parents. They were trying to figure out the world that I actually lived in. And one of those leaders decided to kind of take me under her wing. And she was wonderful. And anyway, I got closer and closer to Christ as that school year went on. And I went on a backpacking trip at the end of the school year for an end of the school year retreat. And that's where I accepted Christ, up in the High Sierras. And I actually sat in an eagle's nest when I was accepting the Lord. I had climbed a bunch of rocks. I know you can't imagine me being a climber, but I was. And I didn't know it was an eagle's nest until somebody told me later on, you disturbed a nest. How dare you? Anyway, but it was my spot with the Lord. And when I went home, I was filled with joy and excited, and my dad got really curious. I started sneaking out on Wednesday nights to go to church, and I was going to that Pentecostal church that they didn't want me to be a part of. So I was getting grounded because I was going to church. Anyway, that's the rebel I was. And it was a beautiful thing, though. It was the first time I ever told my dad no. And he wanted me to be more involved in the Masonic Lodge, which is something he was involved in. And I had talked to my Young Life leader about it, and she was like, you really don't want to go any further in that. And I was like, I know, but my dad expects me to be in that leadership. And she said, you really need to find a way to say no. I was like, you don't understand. She goes, no, I do. And we'll be praying for you. So one day I was in the pool. My dad he'd come home. We always swam every afternoon when he'd come home. Drunk or not, my dad would get in the pool. Anyway, and this one day he started questioning me about why I wasn't stepping up in that Masonic order. And I just looked at him, I said, Dad, I'm not going to do that. I don't believe in what they believe. I believe in Jesus Christ, and that's who I'm going to stand up for. My dad got so angry, and I was really afraid. He didn't talk to me for about 3 weeks. And my mother barely talked to me during that time. It was a really tough time for me. But my dad ended up respecting that no. And that's what, later that year, my dad actually started going to a Bible study and ended up accepting the Lord. And then it took him many years to step away from his leadership position in the Masonic Lodge. But that was his journey. My journey was different, but I had to learn how to say no.
We need to get out of powerlessness and victimization. Being overly compliant for many reasons causes anger and resentment. Being proactive isn't the same thing as being reactive, and people sometimes confuse that. They think if I step out and I'm proactive in something, people are going to think I'm mad at them, or what, and we'll get into that more with the myths part. Reactive victims are often thought of as being against. And one of the things that's interesting about being proactive and not reactive is that it builds appropriate boundaries. People who are reactive, when you set boundaries, it's a symptom of them not having experience or skill in setting healthy boundaries, and lots of times boundary trauma as kids. And they talked about that last week, about how we bring a lot of this into our adulthood. So reaction doesn't change the dynamics. If something isn't going well and setting a boundary isn't going well, getting reactive and angry about it, it doesn't help promote what you're trying to get accomplished. We need to be proactive in setting our boundaries. And the interesting thing about being proactive is it's very freeing. Once you're successful, if you're kind of plowing new ground with boundary setting, once you have a few successes in that, it actually feels pretty good, and it gives you some confidence to move on and to use that skill in other places. And the other thing that being proactive in boundary setting does is if it's done with an honest heart, it also builds a mutual respect with people. People will begin to respect you when you're able to say no or yes. You know, the word tells us, it says, let our no be no and our yes be yes. And the more we practice that honestly and with integrity, I think the more that we build better relationships and more communicative relationships with those around us.
One of the most important things in proactivity is to step away from victimhood. We have to break free from bondage. Becoming a proactive person who's able to establish boundaries is the way that you step away from victimhood. We are to live for God's glory and to love others.
The law of exposure. Boundaries are in effect, as was said before, our property lines. That's where we set up our fences. They determine where we begin and end. And in essence, our person and our core is established in those. The boundaries we set up, when we set up our yard, that's us. That's who we are. Those are the things, we put in there the things that are most valuable to us, our core beliefs, the things that we operate from. And if we don't keep clear boundaries around that, we allow outside things to come in and encroach on our beliefs and our values and our standards. So that's why we have to guard our boundaries.
The Lord tells us in Proverbs 4:23 that we're to guard our heart and to keep our heart with all vigilance because from it flows the springs of life. So it's really important in this, the law of exposure, that we're also not hiding our boundaries from others, because secret boundaries are unfair to others because they cannot respect your boundaries if they're not made visible.
And an interesting thing we see is with people with boundaries, if they're unhealthy boundaries and they're not skilled at setting boundaries, they're not communicated and exposed directly, that's where manipulation begins to come in. If people aren't honest with you about why they're setting the boundaries they're setting, they may be using those against us in a way that's really unhealthy. We create and then what happens is we respond to those in like way by trying to manipulate around it, and we create an unhealthy workaround. It's our natural ability to figure out how to skirt around uncomfortable situations rather than just saying, I'm not okay with this. That's not a good thing for me. I'm not going to agree with that. We'll find some other way to tell the person no without really telling them no. So, it's like your kids. Your kids do that all the time. I mean, especially when they're little, It's like they ask mom says no, they go ask dad. Well, did you ask mom? Well, and pretty soon you figure out, yeah, they really did ask mom said no, so dad says no, and then they try to figure out another way to make it happen. So we kind of come with that skill, and it's important to figure out how to get out of that.
Going back to the law of envy, focusing on what others have drains the energy needed to take responsibility for your own life. The opposite of envy is contentment. Godliness with contentment is great gain, 1 Timothy 6:6. So we need to become thankful for what is within my boundaries, what's in my yard. James 4:2 states that personal conflicts and lack arise from unfulfilled selfish desires. When we have envy, we become destructive because we violate others' boundaries for our own personal gain. Did you have something there? Okay. All right. And then the next one is the law of activity. Boundaries are not passive, and this is a lot like the law of proactivity. They're not passive, and we must take active steps. Much like I did as a kid. I was seeking. So we're supposed to seek and knock to establish these boundaries. When we don't actively seek to establish boundaries, we're literally failing to even try. Pastor talked about this in the story of the talents this week during devotion, and the person who didn't try, he buried his talent, is this person who is violating the law of activity. He didn't do anything, and the Lord gave him some consequences for that. So that's our model there, that Jesus wants us to be active in our faith. And if we don't set boundaries, what we do is we risk becoming a victim of those who want to control others.
The lack of initiative is a big problem because being passive really never pays off. God matches our effort, and he'll never do our work for us. God will never do for us what we need to do for ourselves. He'll give us the skill to do it, he'll give us the ability to do it, but he's not going to step out and do it for us. He won't also invade our boundaries. He wants us to be assertive and take initiative for knocking on the door of life ourselves. And I just figured out what I did. I skipped a page. Sorry. So we backed up.
We got it.
So I was going to throw in one thing about the law of envy, though. Envy is the lowest emotion we have. Envy is what led to the fall. And it's the basis of all the things that we do. Envy undermines relationships and it focuses on what I don't have. And it fails to recognize what good I do have. When we focus on what others have and their accomplishments, Galatians 6:4 says each one should test their own actions, then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. So we really need to learn not to, and with that all comes the whole basis of gratitude. When we're envying other people, we're not being able to be grateful for what we have in our own lives. And a lot of times we just don't see it. I have someone who's very near and dear to me that cannot see gratitude. I mean, they've made huge progress in their life. They've come from living on the streets, being a real mess, to now having a job, a home, a car, all the things that, they never had before. And yet, they're still not really, really happy. Internally, there's not joy. And I think that joy comes from gratitude. And if we don't have gratitude and all we are doing is assessing what other folks have that we don't have, we lose our joy.
Ready to move on to the myths?
Sure.
All right, so the first one is, if I say no, I'm being selfish.
You aren't? Oh. Sorry.
That's the myth. What's the truth, Becky?
Okay, so there's two ways that we can look at this. We look at selfishness and we look at stewardship. And selfishness is a fixation. We start to get fixated on me, I, what I have, what I don't have. And stewardship looks at our wants versus our needs. And so when we're looking at setting boundaries, we look at, are we being selfish in our boundary setting, or are we getting our wants versus our needs met? We have needs, and we need to take care of our needs. It's also selfishness is me on my own. And when we live in stewardship, we understand that our lives are a gift from God, and so is everything that we have. And then selfishness, wishes and desires versus we develop our lives, our abilities, our feelings, our thoughts, and our behaviors. We protect God's investment in us by saying no and by setting clear boundaries. That's how we protect what God's put in us, is with our boundaries.
Myth number 2.
Oh, myth number 2, boundaries are a sign of disobedience. No, they aren't.
A yes given under pressure is compliance, and it's not true obedience. Lack of boundaries is disobedience to God. The next myth is, if I set boundaries, I will be abandoned. Becky.
A big fear in setting healthy boundaries is how others respond. Their response is not, I repeat, not, capital N-O-T, our responsibility. Our healthy functioning is our responsibility. It's our first and foremost responsibility. And for a lot of years, I worked with people who were in addiction and took their kids away from them and terminated their parental rights a lot of times. And, it's like people don't understand that if they can't take care of themselves first and be healthy themselves first, they can't take care of their kids. And they can't take care of their spouse, and they can't take care of the people they love and care about. That's why it's so important that we are really, really focused on how healthy we are as individuals, and a lot of that comes from setting good, clear boundaries.
We cannot control how others respect our yes or our no, and we must not always say yes to keep someone in our life or to keep them happy with us. What happens is it changes the dynamics of our relationships when we violate our yes and our own no.
And one of the things about changing dynamics in relationships is it changes the rule of the game. If you've been married for very long, you know that we all have our family scripts. And if I come home in a really bad mood and I want to start a fight, I know exactly what I need to do to get that accomplished. I know exactly which button to push. I know exactly what button not to push when my spouse is in a really bad mood. I know what not to say too, and because we learn these skills over time. And a lot of times, people don't know how to manage those abilities because they haven't learned good, clear boundaries. Setting boundaries also we teach one another, particularly in a close relationship, how to respond and react to each other without setting those dynamics in place. But always know that when you start to set boundaries that you haven't set before, you change the rules of the game. And the other person has to have a chance to catch up with that. They need to understand what's going on, and back to that honesty thing about being honest about why you're setting that boundary in the first place.
The next myth is that boundaries will hurt those that I love. The truth of this is that limits are a gift that helps others become more responsible. Boundaries are not an offensive weapon, but they are a defensive tool. You had more to say on that?
No.
Okay. You're next, though.
Boundaries are a myth that, boundaries means that I'm angry with you. If I set a boundary, you must have done something wrong if I set a boundary with you. It sets up a sense of offense, almost. Boundaries don't create or reflect anger. Emotions, especially anger, have a function. Often anger tells us our boundaries have been violated. Sometimes when we get really angry, it's justified. Our boundaries have been violated and someone has stepped over a line that they know they shouldn't step over with us. But healthy boundaries decrease anger. The more biblical our boundaries are, the less anger and frustration we experience. Our life becomes much more peaceful when we have clear boundaries and when we've set clear boundaries with those that we're closest with, that we rub up against the most.
Yeah, if we become angry, it's a signal to us. It's that emotional signal that something isn't right, that there's been a violation of a boundary. The next myth is when others set boundaries, it injures me. The truth here is if we want others to respect our boundaries, we must be willing to respect the boundaries of others. When I think of this, I think about the golden rule. And honestly, Becky brought this up, that if we're not respecting others, and not taught to respect boundaries, it's a missed developmental opportunity. Our parents should teach us to respect boundaries. They don't always do that. In my case, they didn't always do that. They violated boundaries a lot. And so I missed that developmental opportunity and had to learn the hard way as an adult how to set those boundaries and how to respect others' boundaries.
Yeah, like Michelle said, inappropriate boundaries can injure us, especially in our early childhood, either by setting inappropriate boundaries or by not setting appropriate ones. These become missed developmental opportunities. And then what we do is we project our own injuries onto others. We take what we've learned and experienced, and we use that as a lens for every interaction we have with other people. And so as we begin to develop more clear boundaries, and we can be clear with others about our boundaries, those conflicts and those offenses go away.
Yeah. All right, the next myth. When others set boundaries, it injures me. The truth here is that if we want others to respect our boundaries, we must be willing to respect the boundaries of others. Did I already read that one? Oh, sorry. The next one is boundaries cause feelings of guilt. The truth is that God doesn't allow the issues of gratitude and boundaries to be confused, and neither should we.
And I'm going to throw an inability to receive someone's boundary may mean there's a codependent relationship. We expect certain things from certain relationships, and one of my favorite phrases is expectations are an opportunity for offense. When we put expectations on people, particularly when they don't know it, we have an opportunity to become offended by them, and that really sets up a negative dynamic. The idea, because we've received something, we owe something, lots of times we avoid setting necessary boundaries. If I take something from you, then I'm expected to repay it. So I'm going to set an unnecessary boundary. I'm going to say, no, I don't want your help. I don't need you. I don't need help from anybody. I can do it myself. When in reality, the whole thing is, what do we owe those who are kind to us? Those who invested in us. We owe them thanks from a grateful heart, and then to turn around and help others in return. We take that and we pay it forward. It's important to distinguish between those who give to get versus those who truly give selflessly. And we have to guard against that too, because sometimes we find out that people will give to get, and that's a really poor boundary.
Offense.
Yeah.
Talking about codependency, you can get into a real cycle with codependency. Someone in your life is a mess and you're trying to fix them, and they're resisting the fix, and so they keep cycling in whatever it is. We were talking about addiction earlier, and so if you're trying to fix someone who's in addiction who doesn't want to be fixed, so they're going to keep in their addiction, and they're going to get a little upset with you, and you at the same time are going to continue to try to fix them. So that's the cycle of codependency. And one thing that I said in my codependent relationship was, okay, which one is more insane? The addict in my life, or me trying to fix that addict, knowing that I'm completely powerless? We had quite a good discussion about the 12 steps because they are biblically based. And both in Al-Anon, which is for codependence, and in any AA group, NA group, any anonymous group, the first step is admitting our powerlessness. And that we have to admit that to God, and that He is the only one who has power, who has the authority to break that cycle of addiction. And that's one of the hardest things for the fixer to come to grips with. And it's an extremely poor boundary. It's a terrible cycle to get into. And unfortunately, until they admit that they're in that cycle, they can't see it. It's a really dangerous cycle.
And it's true, because I stayed in my first marriage beyond the beating and the cheating, which is what I call it, is, because I just thought if I loved him more, if I worked harder, if I did better, if I was a better wife, if I was a better mother to our child, if I forgave enough, if I didn't put too high of expectations on him, if I just understood him more, he would change. And he didn't. And one day I finally had to walk away from it. And sadly enough, at 70 years old, he died of a methamphetamine overdose.
Yeah.
And it's a crazy cycle.
It is.
And as someone once said, if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll get what you always got.
And that's the definition of insanity.
That's exactly right.
So it's not only is it an unhealthy cycle, it can get you into very dangerous places. For me, my mantra was, I need to put up or shut up. Okay, it was very dangerous, and I'll go into that more when we do the marriage. But it was a very very frightening cycle to be in, and it was the same cycle I was in with my dad, and I had no idea. And it wasn't until I finally faced my powerlessness to this that I realized, my gosh, I was steeped in this as a child. So breaking this cycle is not going to be easy, and it took some really introspective and hard work to become the person that I am today. I mean, to this day, I have to look myself in the mirror and say that first step, I'm powerless. I have to say that. Otherwise, I get into the codependent cycle so easily because I grew up as a codependent. It was the only way to survive in my household. My mother was an extreme codependent. She never did realize what that was about. But anyway, we bring this up because it is a very huge reality in our lives that we have a tendency to become fixers, or we have a tendency to be powerless over something in our lives. And so knowing that, learning how to set healthy boundaries, and not getting ourselves into relationships with those who can't set boundaries, those who won't respect your boundaries, is extremely important, and it's expected by the Lord.
Boundaries are permanent, and I am afraid of burning my bridges, so therefore I don't set any. Your no is always subject to you. You own your own boundaries. They don't own you. If you set limits with someone, that can be changed based on their response and how the relationship changes. Or if you're in a safer place, then you're free to do so at that time.
getting to a place of safety is what allows you to start setting up those boundaries. And after a boundary is in place, then you can reevaluate. You think, well, things are changing. Our dynamic is changing. And you can reevaluate that boundary and then decide if that boundary is still necessary or if it should be changed somewhat.
Many myths about boundaries come from misconceptions learned from flawed and distorted teaching. We get a lot of teaching about boundaries and how life and because really all boundaries are, it sounds like it's kind of like this big magical term. And really all it is it's limit setting. It's defining who you are and how you live your life.
And how we sit in relationship with others.
Right. It's really nothing. It's nothing that big, but it's an ongoing process, and it's a constant learning thing. Some of the myths that we hear about and all this stuff come from a fear of standing up and saying no to unbiblical responsibility. It's okay to say no to things that God doesn't expect us to do, or things that we're wanting to be committed to. Saying no is an okay thing. And it's kind of freeing to get to the place where you're okay with saying no, or saying, you just have to know, I'm not comfortable with that. It's an okay thing. This is a ton of information in a whole short period of time. These 2 chapters are really, really chock full of stuff, and it's kind of, in some ways, it's kind of clinical stuff. So if you have questions, or if something we said was confusing or didn't make sense, or you think, well, that was really weird, what did you mean? Feel free to ask us, because it was a lot to try and cover and condense down.
Love. No, boundaries will help those that you love. You make somebody better by setting boundaries.
Pastor,
Go
I
ahead.
have something to say to that. But if you love someone and you begin setting boundaries and setting limits with that person, just like Pastor said, if they reject you outright, and if they make life worse in some way, then that's when you begin to distance yourself. And Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend were very adamant about that in their writings. One thing that I learned from Dr. James Dobson was from a book called Love Must Be Tough. And in my second marriage with his addiction, I had to learn about what's termed as tough love. But Dr. Dobson turned that around and said, no, love must be tough. You must stick to your boundaries, you must protect yourself, and you must protect your children. It's a very important thing. And a lot of people do not come to that understanding without people in their lives who say, wait a minute, you're doing the right thing.
And many times you're not going to set boundaries because you have no belief in yourself. Your confidence has been shattered. Someone has injured your confidence. It has taken that away from you, and now you become subservient to anybody and everybody. So the day that you start setting boundaries is an extremely difficult day, because now you're doing what you're not comfortable in doing. And you're literally beginning to stand up for yourself. and it becomes very uncomfortable. These myths have absolutely, these are absolutely beautiful. Question that maybe one of you guys might have, or even a comment on some of these myths, maybe even one or two of them that you have dealt with in your past. I'd kind of like to hear that myself.